The A-10 Thunderbolt II that landed at Bagram Airfield on September 14, 2011, carried something no aircraft logbook would ever record. Major Kieran Novick shut down both General Electric TF-34 turbofans with hands that hadn't trembled through 4 combat deployments, but shook now in the Afghan dust. The crew chief approaching the weathered Warthog stopped mid-stride when he saw what hung from the pilot's harness, catching late afternoon sun like a fragment of captured fire. A bronze star with Valor device, child-sized, swaying against Novick's survival vest. The chief's radio call went out flat and confused. "Tower, Rattler 6 is down safe, but we've got. I don't know what we've got." Within minutes, the entire flight line knew. The single father who'd flown close air support missions with methodical precision for 7 months had brought his son's medal into combat. Staff Sergeant Dylan Novick, age 9, had died 3 weeks earlier in a hiking accident near their home in Colorado Springs. The medal was his Cub Scout Achievement Award, bronze-finished plastic molded to look like the real thing, earned for a campout where Dylan had helped a younger scout through a thunderstorm. Kieran had pinned it inside his flight suit before launching that morning. Nobody knew why. Nobody asked. They just watched the A-10 taxi in, its GAU-8 Avenger cannon nose still radiating heat, Maverick missile rails empty, and understood that something had changed in the physics of combat aviation. The Warthog's titanium bathtub cockpit was built to protect pilots from ground fire. It wasn't built to contain grief. Operations tempo at Bagram didn't accommodate mourning. Major Novick had taken emergency leave, buried his son, returned to theater early, and requested immediate reinstatement to the flight rotation. His squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Vance Hargrove, had granted it against his better judgment. Kieran was 41 years old, widowed 5 years prior when his wife Rachel succumbed to cancer, and Dylan had been the gravitational center holding him to something beyond military service. The other pilots in the 74th Fighter Squadron watched him with the careful distance accorded to unexploded ordnance. He flew his sorties with mechanical excellence, communicated on tactical frequencies with emotionless precision, and never joined the evening gatherings where crews processed the day's chaos through dark humor and exhaustion. The Warthog he flew, tail number 80242, became an extension of his isolation. But that September morning, launching for a routine patrol over Helmand Province, something shifted. The mission brief had been standard: provide on-call close air support for Marine Corps ground elements conducting village clearing operations near Marja. 4 hours of orbit time, full combat load, expected contact minimal. Kieran had acknowledged the brief with single-word responses, strapped into the A-10's cockpit before dawn, and performed his pre-flight checks with the same methodical rhythm that had carried him through 7,000 flight hours. Except this time, he'd brought Dylan's medal. He'd clipped it to his harness with a carabiner meant for survival gear, and nobody on the ground crew had seen it in the pre-dawn darkness. The mission began normally. Kieran launched as Rattler 6, part of a 2-ship formation with Captain Melissa Torres flying as Rattler 7. They climbed into crystal Afghan sky, the Hindu Kush mountains painting purple shadows across the desert floor. Torres, 32 years old and sharp as broken glass, had tried twice to break through Novick's isolation over the past weeks. Both attempts had met polite deflection. She flew wing position now with growing unease, watching her flight leads Warthog hold formation with geometrical precision that felt less like skill and more like automation. Their tactical frequency remained silent except for mandatory position reports. At 20,000 feet, orbiting over Marja, the war below looked abstract. Smoke from morning cooking fires, the geometric patterns of irrigation channels, the occasional glint of vehicle movement on dirt roads. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller on the ground, a Marine forward air controller with call sign Reaper 1, checked in routinely every 15 minutes. His voice carried the boredom of a quiet morning. That changed at 0840 local time. Reaper 1's transmission cut through the frequency like voltage. Rattler 6, Reaper 1, troops in contact, how copy? Kieran's response came back flat and immediate. Reaper 1, Rattler 6, solid copy, send your lineup. What followed was every close air support pilot's nightmare scenario compressed into 30 seconds of radio traffic. A Marine rifle platoon conducting village clearance had triggered a complex ambush. Insurgent forces had allowed the Marines to push deep into a residential area before initiating contact from 3 directions simultaneously, using prepositioned machine gun nests, RPG teams, and a coordinated mortar barrage. The Marines were pinned in a dried-out irrigation canal, with wounded taking accurate fire from hardened positions they couldn't flank, and the nearest quick reaction force was 18 minutes out. Reaper 1 transmitted grid coordinates with the controlled urgency of someone watching friends die. Rattler 6, I've got approximately 15 to 20 enemy fighters in tree line bearing 270 from my position. Danger close to friendly forces, 75 meters. Permission requested for gun run, north to south axis. Kieran rolled the A-10 into a descending turn without hesitation. Captain Torres followed, her wingman discipline perfect despite the adrenaline spike. They dropped from 20,000 feet to 12,000 in a controlled dive, both pilots scanning through their targeting pods for the engagement area. The village of Marja spread below them like a geometric puzzle, brown mud brick compounds separated by narrow alleys, the tree line marking a wadi system on the western edge. Kieran's targeting pod painted the scene in grayscale digital precision. He could see the Marines' position, tiny figures pressed against an irrigation canal's crumbling walls. 75 meters west, muzzle flashes sparked from fighting positions dug into the tree line. The range was insanely close for a GAU-8 gun run. The Avenger cannon fired 30mm depleted uranium rounds at 65 per second, with a burst radius that didn't care about good intentions. 1 degree of error at that range would put rounds into the Marines instead of the insurgents. Kieran's voice came back over tactical frequency with the same flat affect he'd carried for weeks. Reaper 1, Rattler 6 is visual. Confirm you want gun on the tree line, 75 meters west of your position. I need talk-on for final clearance. Captain Torres broke protocol with a clipped transmission. Rattler 6, Rattler 7, that's danger close plus. Recommend Maverick from altitude. She was right. A Maverick missile offered standoff distance, reduced collateral damage risk, and clean separation between friendly and enemy forces. It was the textbook solution. Kieran ignored her. Reaper 1, Rattler 6, say type of mark. The JTAC's response came through gunfire audible in his transmission background. Rattler 6, I'm marking with red smoke, 30 seconds. Below, a crimson smoke grenade arced from the Marine position, trailing ruby smoke that caught the morning sun. The wind was minimal. The smoke drifted slightly north, marking the friendly position with chemical precision. Kieran rolled the A-10 inverted, pulled the nose down toward the tree line, and transmitted to his wingman with mechanical calm. Rattler 7, hold high and cover. I'm in hot. The A-10 Warthog's titanium bathtub cockpit enclosed Kieran like a coffin as he rolled wings level in a 30-degree dive angle. The tree line filled his heads-up display, muzzle flashes still sparking from prepared fighting positions. His targeting pipper drifted across the grayscale image, small corrections made through stick pressure so minute they were more intention than movement. The GAU-8 cannon ran through the aircraft's centerline like a spine, 7 barrels rotating with mechanical hunger. Kieran's thumb rested on the trigger. Dylan's metal swung forward against the instrument panel from the dive angle, the cheap bronze catching cockpit light. For 3 seconds, Kieran Novick stared at that piece of plastic and remembered his son's face when he'd received it, the pride of a 9-year-old who'd helped someone smaller through a storm. The memory arrived complete and devastating. Then his thumb squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger roared to life with a sound like the earth tearing open. 30mm depleted uranium rounds screamed downrange at nearly 3,000 feet per second, 65 rounds per second, each round capable of punching through tank armor. The 7 rotating barrels produced a sound on the ground that survivors would describe as God's zipper opening the sky. From Kieran's cockpit, It was a deep vibration that rattled his teeth and a recoil force that slowed the A-10 measurably in flight. He walked the burst across the tree line with microsecond corrections, 30-millimeter rounds chewing through fighting positions with mechanical precision. The depleted uranium rounds ignited on impact, turning the tree line into a strobe light hell of explosions and disintegrating vegetation. Kieran held the trigger for 3 seconds, a long burst by A-10 standards, before pulling off target and climbing. The aircraft shuddered through the pull, both engines screaming. "Rattler 6 is off hot north to south," he transmitted, his voice still carrying that flat mechanical quality. Captain Torres, orbiting at altitude, watched through her targeting pod as the tree line transformed into burning wreckage. Reaper 1's transmission came through 5 seconds later, his voice raw. "Rattler 6, Reaper 1, good hits, danger close confirmed, all enemy positions destroyed. You just saved 15 Marines." Kieran didn't respond immediately. He climbed back to altitude, hands steady on the stick, and looked down at Dylan's medal still swinging from his harness. The plastic had cracked slightly from the GAU-8's vibration, a hairline fracture running through the cheap bronze finish. He touched it with one gloved finger, an intimacy invisible to everyone else in the sky. Captain Torres' voice cut through the tactical frequency, sharper now. "Rattler 6, confirm your mission capable for continued support." It was a wellness check disguised as tactical communication. She'd watched that gun run and recognized something in its execution that went beyond standard close air support. The precision had been inhuman, the risk calculation divorced from self-preservation. Kieran keyed his radio. "Rattler 7, Rattler 6 is mission capable. Reaper 1, Rattler 6 is repositioning for high cover. Maintain contact as required." Below, the Marines were extracting wounded from the irrigation canal, using the breathing space Kieran's gun run had purchased. The tree line still burned, black smoke rising into clear morning sky. The mission continued for 3 more hours. Kieran flew coverage while Marine rifle platoons cleared compounds and cached enemy weapons. He didn't speak except when tactical necessity demanded it. Captain Torres maintained wing position, watching her flight lead with growing concern that she'd document later in her post-mission report. The concern would go nowhere. By the time they returned to Bagram, the crew chief had spotted Dylan's medal, and the strange accounting of grief and combat effectiveness had already begun writing itself into squadron legend. Nobody could explain why bringing a dead child's medal into combat had transformed Kieran from competent to supernatural. Nobody wanted to try. They just watched him land, taxi in, and shut down both engines with hands that no longer trembled. The Bronze Star with Valor device, child-sized, cracked, still catching Afghan sun, hung from his harness like an answer to a question nobody had figured out how to ask. The debrief in the 74th Fighter Squadron's operations room lasted 90 minutes and solved nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove sat across from Kieran at a metal table scarred by coffee rings and frustration, Torres standing by the wall with her arms crossed. Outside, the late afternoon heat made the flight line shimmer. Hargrove was 53 years old, career Air Force, and had commanded enough pilots through enough wars to recognize when someone was operating beyond standard psychological parameters. He'd read the JTAC's report. Danger close gun run, 75 meters from friendly forces, perfect execution under circumstances that should have produced catastrophe. Then he'd read Torres' account, which included the detail about Kieran flying with his son's medal clipped to his survival harness. Hargrove set both reports on the table and looked at his pilot with exhausted compassion. "Major Novak, I need you to explain your decision-making on that gun run. Captain Torres recommended Maverick from altitude. You chose to press with the gun at danger-close range. Walk me through the calculus." Kieran sat motionless, still wearing his flight suit, the medal now removed and sitting in his locker. His answer came in the same mechanical tone he'd used all morning. "Sir, the Maverick would have required additional target confirmation and added 30 seconds to time on target. The Marines were taking casualties. The gun was the fastest solution that guaranteed immediate effect on target. Wind conditions were minimal, visibility was excellent, and the JTAC's mark was precise. Risk assessment fell within acceptable parameters for danger-close employment. It was a perfect answer. It was also a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Tors pushed off the wall. Kieran, that wasn't acceptable parameters. That was suicide parameters if anything went wrong. Your dive angle, your altitude at trigger pull, the burst length. You were threading a needle that had no business being threaded. She'd used his first name, breaking the formality that usually governed squadron interactions, and the intimacy of it hung in the air like smoke. Kieran turned to look at her, and for the first time that day, something shifted in his expression. Not emotion exactly, but a crack in the mechanical facade. Captain Tors, the gun run was successful. The Marines are alive. The mission parameters were met. I don't understand what requires additional explanation. Hargrove leaned forward. Major, I'm not questioning your skill. I'm questioning your judgment. You're flying combat missions 3 weeks after burying your son. You're bringing personal items into the cockpit. You're taking risks that suggest your decision-making is compromised by factors beyond tactical necessity. I need to know if you're fit for continued operations. The silence that followed was total. Outside, an F-16 launched from the runway with a sound like thunder, but inside the operations room, nothing moved. Kieran looked down at his hands, still steady despite everything, and tried to find words for something that had no language. Sir, Dylan's medal. It's a Cub Scout Achievement Award. He earned it for helping a younger kid during a campout. There was a thunderstorm and the younger boy was scared, and Dylan stayed with him all night in a tent, telling him stories about airplanes. Kieran's voice didn't break, but it changed pitch slightly, the first crack in weeks of mechanical control. Dylan wanted to be a pilot. He asked me every day what it was like to fly, what it felt like to help people from the sky. I told him it was like being everywhere and nowhere at once, like being able to fix problems before they became disasters. He understood that. He understood helping people even when you're scared. Tors and Hargrove exchanged glances. Kieran continued, still looking at his hands. This morning, I brought the medal because I wanted him to see what I do. I wanted him to understand that the job isn't about killing. It's about preventing worse things from happening. Those Marines in that irrigation canal, they have kids, they have families. Dylan would have wanted them to go home. Hargrove let the silence stretch, then spoke quietly. Kieran, grief doesn't work that way. You can't fly combat missions as a memorial service. Kieran looked up, and his eyes were clear but empty in a way that made Tors step forward instinctively. Sir, with respect, I don't know any other way to process this. Dylan's gone. Rachel's gone. The only thing I have left is the job, and the job makes sense in a way that nothing else does right now. When I'm in that cockpit, when I'm putting rounds on target, when I'm keeping Marines alive, that's the only time the world doesn't feel like it's collapsing. So I brought his medal because I needed him with me, and it worked. I flew the mission. I made the decisions. The Marines lived. That's all that matters. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove was a good commander, which meant he understood when to enforce regulations and when to acknowledge that human psychology existed in dimensions beyond policy manuals. He looked at Kieran for a long moment, then at Tors, then back at his pilot. Major Novak, you're grounded for 72 hours, effective immediately. You'll attend 3 sessions with the squadron flight surgeon for psychological evaluation. If the surgeon clears you, and if Captain Tors agrees to fly as your dedicated wingman for the next month, you can return to flight status. But the medal stays on the ground. No personal items in the cockpit beyond standard gear. Are we clear? Kieran nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Tors spoke before Hargrove could dismiss them. Sir, request permission to fly as Rattler 6's wingman for extended rotation. I'll monitor and report any concerns. Hargrove looked at her with something between gratitude and resignation. Granted, dismissed. They left the operations room in silence, walking out into the blast furnace heat of Bagram's flight line. Tors caught up with Kieran before he reached his quarters. You know the flight surgeon's going to clear you, right? You're too controlled to fail a psych eval. But that doesn't mean you're okay. Kieran stopped, turned to face her, and for the first time since Dylan's death, something like genuine human connection flickered across his expression. "Captain Torres, I'm not okay. I'm never going to be okay, but I can still fly, and that's going to have to be enough." The 72-hour grounding period passed in bureaucratic slow motion. Kieran attended his sessions with the squadron flight surgeon, a major named Patricia Everett who had 20 years of military psychology experience, and immediately recognized she was dealing with someone whose grief had calcified into functional armor. She asked the standard questions about sleep patterns, intrusive thoughts, risk assessment, and family support networks. Kieran answered with mechanical precision, describing his sleep as adequate, his thought processes as focused, his risk tolerance as appropriate to mission parameters, and his support network as consisting of squadron personnel who provided professional camaraderie. None of it was true, but all of it was defensible. Major Everett knew she was watching a performance but couldn't identify any clinical criteria that justified removing Kieran from flight status. His affect was flat, but not inappropriately so for combat operations. His decision-making, while aggressive, remained within doctrinal boundaries. His physical health was excellent. The only red flag was the intangible sense that Kieran Novick was operating beyond normal human limits by completely shutting down whatever made humans vulnerable. She cleared him for return to flight status with a recommendation for ongoing monitoring, which everyone understood meant nothing. On the fourth day, Kieran returned to the flight line. Captain Torres was waiting by his aircraft, tail number 800242, which the ground crew had maintained with unusual care during his absence. The Warthog looked the same as always, ugly, functional, covered in the scars of sustained combat operations. But something had shifted in how the other pilots looked at it. Word of the danger-close gun run had spread through Bagram's aviation community with the velocity of myth. The story had acquired details in the telling, the impossible accuracy, the split-second timing, the metal hanging from Novick's harness like a talisman. Some versions claimed the GAU-8 rounds had passed within 50 meters of the Marine position. Others said Kieran had been flying the approach inverted. None of the embellishments were necessary. The truth was extraordinary enough. Torres intercepted him before he reached the aircraft. "Morning, Rattler 6. Ready to fly boring patrols under my watchful eye." Her tone was light, but her posture was all business. Kieran offered a fractional smile, the first she'd seen in weeks. "Morning, Rattler 7. Boring sounds acceptable." They walked the pre-flight together, an unnecessary ritual since the crew chiefs had already certified the aircraft, but Torres wanted the time. She watched Kieran perform his walk-around inspection with the same methodical precision he applied to everything, checking for hydraulic leaks, examining the GAU-8 cannon's 7 rotating barrels, verifying the Maverick missiles seated correctly on their rails. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but Torres noticed he paused slightly when he reached the cockpit ladder. "Dylan's medal is in your locker," she asked quietly. Kieran nodded. "Locked away. Won't be flying with me anymore." Torres stepped closer, lowering her voice so the ground crew wouldn't hear. "Kieran, that gun run, that wasn't about the medal. That was about you trying to do something so perfectly impossible that it would mean something. But you can't keep flying like that. You're going to run out of impossible eventually." Kieran looked at her with those clear, empty eyes. "Maybe. But until then, I've got Marines to keep alive." He climbed the ladder and strapped into the cockpit, beginning his pre-flight checks with mechanical rhythm. Torres watched for a moment longer, then walked to her own aircraft. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just become the wingman to someone whose grief had transformed into something combat aviation had no doctrine for handling. The mission brief that morning was routine. 4-hour patrol over Kandahar province, on-call close air support for Army operations, expected contact minimal. They launched into clear sky, climbing east toward the mountains, 2 A-10 Warthogs in perfect formation. The war waited below, patient and indifferent, and Kieran Novick flew above it with empty hands and a cracked medal left behind, searching for meaning in the geometry of violence and protection. 3 weeks passed before the second incident that would reshape Kieran's legend. The 74th Fighter Squadron flew daily missions through October, and Kieran returned to his pattern of mechanical excellence. Captain Torres flew as his dedicated wingman, watching for signs of deterioration that never materialized. He executed his missions with textbook precision, communicated professionally, and maintained the same emotional distance from squadron life that had characterized him since Dylan's death. The other pilots stopped trying to engage him in off-duty conversation. He became a fixture at Bagram, the grieving single father who flew like a machine, respected but isolated, effective but unreachable. The routine shattered on October 9th during a mission that began as harassment interdiction in the Arghandab River Valley. Kieran and Torres launched as Rattler Flight, tasked with disrupting Taliban supply lines along Highway 1. Intelligence had identified several compounds being used as logistic staging areas for IED construction. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: locate targets, confirm hostile activity, destroy infrastructure with Maverick missiles, return to base. They found the compounds exactly where intelligence predicted: mud brick structures with fresh vehicle tracks and communications equipment visible through their targeting pods. Kieran was coordinating with the ground controller to confirm targeting authority when Tor's urgent transmission cut through the frequency. Rattler 6, Rattler 7, I've got movement, bearing 090 from the primary compound, approximately 200 meters. Multiple personnel, small arms visible. Kieran slaved his targeting pod to Tor's coordinates and felt his breathing change. Through the grayscale digital feed, he could see what she'd spotted: a group of approximately 8 children, aged roughly 6 to 12 years old, walking along an irrigation canal. They were herding goats, completely unaware that they were 200 meters from a compound about to be destroyed by Maverick missiles. The targeting geometry was straightforward. The missiles would impact the compound with minimal blast radius, but 200 meters was close enough that fragmentation could reach the children if the wind shifted or if secondary explosions occurred. Standard doctrine called for delaying the strike until the children cleared the area. Kieran's voice came back over tactical frequency with mechanical calm. Rattler 7, confirm visual on civilian personnel, approximately 8 children, 200 meters east of target compound. Hold fire, maintain orbit. Torres acknowledged, and they circled at 15,000 feet while the children moved with the agonizing slowness of goats and morning routine. The ground controller, call sign Sabre 2, transmitted with growing impatience. Rattler 6, Sabre 2, how long until you can engage? We've got intelligence suggesting the compound is being used for IED construction with immediate operational timeline. Kieran watched the children through his targeting pod. They'd stopped to let the goats drink from the canal. One of the older boys was throwing rocks at something in the water. A girl in a blue dress was sitting on the canal's edge, her feet dangling in the water. They looked like Dylan had looked on summer afternoons in Colorado, unaware of adult dangers, existing completely in the moment. Sabre 2, Rattler 6, civilians are still within fragmentation range. Estimate 10 minutes until clear for weapons employment. The controller's response carried barely suppressed frustration. Rattler 6, confirm you're delaying strike for civilian traffic. Be advised we have time-sensitive targeting criteria on this mission. Torres broke in, her voice tight. Sabre 2, Rattler 7, that's affirm. We have 8 children within danger radius. Requesting delay is non-negotiable. Silence on the frequency. Then Sabre 2 came back with resigned acknowledgement. Rattler Flight, Sabre 2 copies. Maintain orbit, keep eyes on target compound for hostile activity change. They circled for 18 minutes. The children eventually moved on, the goats in tow, disappearing behind a rise in the terrain. Kieran confirmed they were clear, received authorization for weapons employment, and put 2 Maverick missiles into the compound with surgical precision. The structure collapsed in twin explosions, secondary blasts indicating stored munitions. The mission was successful by every metric, but something had changed in Kieran during those 18 minutes of waiting. That night back at Bagram, Kieran sat alone in the small room he'd been assigned in the officers' quarters. The space was aggressively impersonal, standard-issue furniture, bare walls, nothing to indicate anyone actually lived there. He'd unpacked the minimum necessary for functioning: uniforms, toiletries, a single photograph of Dylan that he kept face down in a drawer because looking at it made the world tilt. But tonight, he took the photograph out. Dylan at age 8, grinning at the camera, holding a model airplane they'd built together. His son's face was pure joy, uncomplicated by the knowledge that life could be arbitrarily cruel. Kieran stared at that photograph for an hour, and something inside the mechanical armor he'd constructed began to crack. He'd spent 3 weeks flying combat missions as an emotional escape, using the precision of close air support as a substitute for processing grief. But watching those children in the Arghandab River Valley, he'd suddenly understood what he was actually doing. He wasn't honoring Dylan's memory. He was trying to save his son over and over again by keeping other people's children alive. It was a revelation that didn't make anything easier. Kieran set the photograph on his desk, face up this time, and tried to figure out how to carry both grief and responsibility without collapsing under the weight. He didn't have an answer. But sitting there in the fluorescent light of military quarters, thousands of miles from home, he made a decision. He'd stop trying to fly away from Dylan's death and start flying toward something that might eventually resemble meaning. The difference was subtle but fundamental. The next morning, Captain Torres noticed the change immediately. Kieran showed up for the mission brief early, as always, but his posture was fractionally less rigid. When she asked if he was okay, he actually answered instead of deflecting. "I'm working on it," he said, and it was the most honest thing he'd spoken in months. They launched that day for another patrol, and Torres watched her flight lead with cautious optimism. Maybe Kieran Novick was going to survive this after all. The months that followed rewrote the expectations of what a single pilot could accomplish in a combat zone. Kieran flew mission after mission with an intensity that transcended standard proficiency. He became the pilot every ground controller requested specifically, the close air support asset that units in contact wanted overhead, the name that circulated through forward operating bases as shorthand for competence under impossible circumstances. The missions blurred together in a catalog of precision and protection. November brought a rescue operation in Kunar province, where Kieran held off insurgent forces for 90 minutes, while a downed helicopter crew was extracted. His gun runs so accurate that he was cleared to fire within 50 meters of friendly positions. December involved a compound clearance gone catastrophic in Helmand, where he talked a young JTAC through his first troops in contact scenario, while simultaneously coordinating strikes from 3 aircraft. January delivered a running firefight along the Pakistani border, where he flew extended time on station despite low fuel warnings, refusing to leave until replacement aircraft arrived. The pattern became recognizable. Kieran would accept the impossible missions, execute them flawlessly, and return to base without discussing the details. Captain Torres flew as his wingman through all of it, watching with a mixture of admiration and concern as her flight lead operated beyond normal human limits. The squadron's leadership struggled with how to process his effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove reviewed mission reports that documented extraordinary tactical success, while clearly indicating that Kieran was still using combat as grief therapy. But how do you ground a pilot who kept saving lives? How do you tell someone their coping mechanism is unhealthy when it was keeping other people's children alive? The bureaucratic machinery couldn't find a category for Kieran Novick. He became an anomaly that everyone simply learned to work around. The other pilots in the squadron began calling him the architect because his strike planning had geometrical precision that bordered on artistic. The SEALs operating in-country requested him by name for close air support on their operations, which was unprecedented. Special operations forces usually wanted their own dedicated aviation assets, but they made an exception for Rattler 6. The defining moment came in February during a mission that shouldn't have been remarkable. A Navy SEAL team was conducting a high-value target capture operation in the mountains near Tora Bora, moving through terrain so rough that helicopter insertion was impossible. They'd infiltrated on foot, moving through valleys that hadn't seen American presence in years, and their close air support package consisted of Kieran and Tors orbiting at altitude. The mission brief had estimated low probability of significant resistance. The Taliban had other ideas. The SEAL team hit their target compound and immediately walked into a prepared ambush. They'd been compromised somewhere in the infiltration, and the Taliban had set up a killing zone designed specifically to counter helicopter extraction. Multiple machine gun positions in the high ground, RPG teams in covered positions, and a mortar crew that began dropping rounds with practiced accuracy. The SEALs went aground in a small cluster of buildings, returning fire while their team leader transmitted situation reports with clinical calm despite the chaos. Kieran was overhead within minutes, his targeting pod painting the entire engagement area in digital detail. What he saw made his breath catch. The SEALs were surrounded in terrain that negated every advantage they normally held. No helicopter could get in to extract them. The nearest quick reaction force was 40 minutes out. The Taliban were maneuvering to collapse the perimeter and overrun the position. It was a scenario designed to produce American casualties, and time was measured in minutes. The SEAL team leader, call sign Trident 1, transmitted coordinates for immediate close air support. Rattler 6, Trident 1, requesting immediate gun run on enemy positions bearing 220 from my location. 100 meters, multiple targets, danger close, cleared hot. 100 meters was suicide range for a GAU-8 run. The margin for error was essentially zero. Tor's voice cut through the tactical frequency before Kieran could respond. Rattler 6, Rattler 7, recommend Maverick from altitude standoff engagement, reduced risk to friendly forces. She was right again. It was the textbook answer. And once again, Kieran ignored it. Trident 1, Rattler 6 is visual. Confirm you're requesting gun at 100 meters, danger close. I need positive confirmation and mark. The SEAL's response came through automatic weapons fire. Rattler 6, affirm gun at 100 meters, marking now with infrared strobe, visible on your targeting pod. We're out of options here. If you can't do this, we're going to have a bad day. Kieran looked down at his harness where Dylan's medal used to hang. The space was empty, but he could feel the weight of it anyway, the ghost of his son's pride in helping people through storms. He thought about the SEALs on the ground, professionals who'd volunteered for impossible missions because someone had to, and he thought about their families who didn't yet know this might be the day everything changed. Then he rolled the A-10 into a 40-degree dive and became something more than human. The dive angle was steeper than doctrine recommended. The altitude at trigger pull was lower than safety margins allowed. The burst length was longer than standard engagement parameters. But Kieran's hands moved with the precision of someone who'd transcended mechanical skill and entered territory where muscle memory merged with geometric certainty. The GAU-8 roared to life, 30-millimeter rounds screaming downrange at velocities that turned physics into poetry. He walked the burst across Taliban fighting positions with microsecond corrections, each round placed with surgical intent. The depleted uranium penetrators transformed the mountainside into cascading explosions, machine gun nests disintegrating, RPG positions vaporizing, human figures disappearing into fire and fragmentation. Kieran held the trigger for 5 seconds, an eternity in close air support terms, then pulled off target and climbed. The A-10 shuddered through the recovery, both engines screaming protest, the entire aircraft vibrating from the GAU-8's recoil force. The tactical frequency stayed silent for 3 seconds. Then Trident 1's voice came back, shaking with something between awe and disbelief. Rattler 6, Trident 1. Jesus Christ. All enemy positions destroyed, no friendly casualties. You just threaded a needle that doesn't exist. We owe you a case of beer and probably our firstborn children. Kieran's response came back with the same mechanical calm he'd carried for months, but underneath it something had changed. Trident 1, Rattler 6, no payment necessary. Just get your team home safe. He climbed back to altitude and resumed orbit while the SEALs consolidated their position and waited for extraction helicopters. Tors joined formation beside him, her voice tight on their private frequency. Kieran, that was the single most impressive and most insane gun run I've ever witnessed. You know that was impossible, right? Nobody threads geometry like that. Kieran looked out his canopy at the Hindu Kush mountains stretching to the horizon, snow-capped peaks glowing in afternoon sun. He thought about Dylan, about Rachel, about all the people who weren't coming home, and about the ones who still might if someone was willing to fly into the impossible spaces. It wasn't impossible, he transmitted back quietly. It was just necessary. Below, the SEAL team was being extracted by helicopter, the crisis resolved through violence and precision, and the geometry of grief transformed into protection. The mission would generate another report documenting Kieran's extraordinary capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove would read it with resigned admiration. The other pilots would add another story to the growing legend of Rattler 6. And Kieran Novick would return to Bagram, land his scarred A-10, shut down both engines and climb out of the cockpit carrying burdens that had shifted from crushing to merely heavy. That night, Captain Tors found him sitting alone on the flight line, looking up at the stars. She sat down beside him without asking permission. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Kieran broke the silence. Dylan would have liked today's mission. He would have understood why I took the shot. Tors looked at him. Yeah, he would have, and he would have been proud of you. Kieran nodded slowly. I'm trying to earn that. I'm trying to do work that would make him proud. I don't know if it's working, but it's all I've got. Tors put a hand on his shoulder, human contact he hadn't accepted since before his son's death. It's working, Kieran. You're keeping people alive. That matters. They sat together under Afghan stars, and grief became slightly less isolating. The transformation didn't happen dramatically. There was no single moment where Kieran Novick healed or found peace or resolved his relationship with catastrophic loss. Instead, through March and April of 2012, he slowly reintegrated with the squadron in ways that had seemed impossible months earlier. He started attending the evening gatherings where pilots processed missions through dark humor and exhaustion. He participated in planning sessions with input beyond mechanical acknowledgement. He even smiled occasionally, a rare fractional expression that made the other pilots pause because it seemed like watching statues learn to breathe. Captain Tors remained his dedicated wingman, but their relationship evolved beyond monitoring into genuine partnership. She learned to anticipate his decision-making in ways that made their two-ship formations operate with fluid precision. He learned to trust her judgment and occasionally defer to her recommendations, which represented progress given his previous isolation. They became Rattler flight in the full sense, not just call signs but a functional unit where both pilots elevated each other's capabilities. The missions continued at relentless pace. The 74th Fighter Squadron was engaged in sustained combat operations across Afghanistan's southern provinces, and Kieran flew every sortie he was cleared for. But the nature of his engagement changed. He stopped using combat as escape and started flying with intentional purpose. The difference was subtle but observable. He'd arrive at briefings having studied not just his assigned area but the broader strategic picture, understanding how his close air support missions connected to ground force objectives and campaign-level goals. He'd ask questions during mission planning about civilian population patterns and collateral damage mitigation, demonstrating concern for consequences beyond immediate tactical success. And he'd debrief his missions with detailed analysis, sharing lessons learned and tactical insights that improved the entire squadron's effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove watched this evolution with cautious optimism. He'd commanded enough pilots through enough trauma to recognize that some people shattered, and some people refined themselves through pressure. Kieran appeared to be refining, using grief as a catalyst for becoming more rather than less human. The validation came not from leadership but from the ground forces who worked with him. By May 2012, Kieran's reputation had spread beyond Bagram to every forward operating base in Regional Command South. Ground controllers would specifically request Rattler 6 when planning complex operations. Infantry commanders would mention him in their operational briefings as a key asset for high-risk missions. And the Marines, soldiers and SEALs who'd been under his protection, began telling stories that took on mythological dimensions. There was the time he'd kept a surrounded platoon alive through an A-tower siege, cycling off for fuel and immediately returning while other aircraft provided gap coverage. There was the mission where he'd talked a wounded JTAC through calling in danger-close strikes, despite the controller being barely conscious from blood loss. There was the night operation where he'd provided close air support using infrared targeting alone, destroying enemy positions within 50 meters of friendly forces in complete darkness. The stories multiplied, each one adding layers to the legend of the single father who flew with impossible precision, because he'd already survived the worst thing that could happen. But the story that cemented Kieran's legacy happened in June, during a mission that brought together every element of his transformation. A Marine rifle company was conducting a major clearing operation in Sangin District, one of the most violent areas in Helmand Province. The operation involved multiple platoons moving through a series of compounds known to be Taliban strongholds, supported by extensive air assets including attack helicopters, fast movers, and close air support packages. Kieran and Tors launched as part of that support, expecting a long day of coordinated strikes and sustained combat. What they got was worse. The Marines walked into a catastrophic ambush that appeared to have been planned specifically to inflict mass casualties. The Taliban had prepared the engagement area with sophisticated defensive positions, overlapping fields of fire, pre-positioned IEDs, and coordinated mortar fire. Within minutes of the Marines entering the kill zone, multiple platoons were pinned down, taking casualties, unable to maneuver or extract wounded. The situation devolved so rapidly that the ground force commander's initial casualty report listed 15 wounded and 3 killed in action, with numbers expected to rise. The tactical frequency erupted into controlled chaos. Multiple JTACs were calling for immediate air support. Helicopter pilots were reporting they couldn't reach the casualty collection point due to ground fire, and the ground force commander was trying to coordinate responses to simultaneous crises across a kilometer-wide engagement area. Kieran arrived overhead and immediately understood the situation was beyond standard close air support procedures. This wasn't a single target engagement. This was a complex, multi-dimensional disaster requiring someone to impose order on chaos through violence and precision. He keyed his radio and transmitted with calm that cut through the frequency clutter. All stations, Rattler 6, I have overall situational awareness from altitude. Recommend we establish priority of fires and systematic engagement sequence. Break. Rattler 7, take western positions. I'll take eastern and central. Break. All JTACs switch to their assigned aircraft and stand by for coordinated strikes. It was a bold transmission. Kieran was essentially assuming tactical control of the entire air support package, coordinating multiple aircraft against multiple targets based on his own assessment of priority. It violated protocol in a dozen ways. It was also exactly what the situation required. For the next 4 hours, Kieran Novick orchestrated a masterclass in close air support under impossible circumstances. He directed Tors against Taliban positions, threatening the Marines' western flank while he worked the eastern and central threats. He coordinated with attack helicopters to suppress anti-aircraft fire, enabling casualty evacuation flights to reach the wounded. He talked 3 different JTACs through calling in danger-close strikes, while simultaneously managing his own weapons employment. He cycled off station for fuel and returned faster than should have been possible, maintaining continuous pressure on Taliban forces who kept trying to overrun the Marine positions. And through it all, he flew with the precision that had become his signature, placing rounds within margins that made other pilots uncomfortable even watching through their targeting pods. The GAU-8 sang its terrible song repeatedly that day. 30-millimeter rounds carved through fighting positions, compound walls, vehicle-mounted weapons, and human targets with geometric efficiency. By late afternoon, the Taliban assault had collapsed. The Marines held their positions, consolidated their wounded, and began the grim process of recovering their dead. The final casualty count was 5 killed in action and 23 wounded, catastrophic numbers that would have been far worse without the sustained air support. The ground force commander, a Marine lieutenant colonel named Marcus Wade, transmitted a message to Rattler 6 as the operation wound down. Rattler 6, this is Warhorse 6. I don't have adequate words for what you did today. You kept my Marines alive through something that should have been a massacre. When we get back to base, I'm buying you whatever you want to drink and then I'm writing you up for a medal. Kieran's response came back tired but sincere. Warhorse 6, Rattler 6, no medal necessary. Just get your Marines home. That's payment enough. He and Tors flew back to Bagram in silence, both pilots exhausted beyond anything physical training could prepare for. They landed as the sun was setting, painting the Hindu Kush mountains in shades of amber and crimson. Kieran shut down his engines, completed his post-flight checks, and climbed out of the cockpit moving like someone twice his age. The ground crew chief approached with the usual post-mission questions, but stopped when he saw Kieran's expression. The pilot's face was gray with fatigue, but his eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been since September. Sir, aircraft's in good shape considering what you put her through today. Anything we need to know for maintenance? Kieran shook his head slowly. She flew perfect. Take care of her. She saved a lot of lives today. He walked toward the squadron building with Tors beside him, neither of them speaking. Behind them, the A-10 sat on the flight line, scorched from repeated gun runs, missile rails empty, the titanium bathtub cockpit still radiating heat. The aircraft looked like it had been through a war, which was accurate. Inside the squadron building, Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove was waiting with the mission reports already compiled. He looked at Kieran with something beyond respect, something closer to understanding. Major Novak, that was extraordinary work today. The Marines are calling you a guardian angel. I'm calling you the best close air support pilot I've ever seen. How are you holding up? Kieran considered the question with unusual honesty. Sir, I'm tired, I'm sad. I miss my son every minute of every day, but I'm okay. For the first time since Dylan died, I think I'm actually okay. Hargrove nodded slowly. You've been flying like you're trying to save everyone because you couldn't save him. Is that still what's happening? Kieran looked at the mission reports on Hargrove's desk, documents that reduced the day's violence to coordinates and timestamps in clinical language. No, sir, I've been flying like this because saving people is the only thing I know how to do that matters. Dylan's gone. Rachel's gone. I can't bring them back, but I can keep other people's families intact, and that feels like work worth doing. It doesn't fix the grief, but it makes the grief meaningful. Does that make sense? Hargrove smiled, a rare expression for a squadron commander in a combat zone. Yeah, Kieran, that makes perfect sense. You're cleared for continued operations. Get some rest, you've earned it. Kieran left the office and walked through the warm Afghan evening toward his quarters. Captain Tors caught up with him halfway there. You meant what you said in there about being okay. It wasn't a question. Kieran stopped, looked up at the stars starting to appear in the darkening sky, and thought about Dylan's face when he'd received that Cub Scout medal. The memory still hurt, but it hurt in a way that felt bearable now. Yeah, I meant it. I'm carrying this differently now. It's still heavy, but I can carry it and fly at the same time. I can carry it and help people. That's progress. Tors smiled. Dylan would be proud of you. You know that, right? Kieran felt his throat tighten but managed to keep his voice steady. I hope so. That's what I'm working toward, doing work that would make him proud. Everything else is secondary. They stood together in the gathering darkness, two pilots who'd flown through impossible geometry and emerged intact. Around them, Bagram hummed with the constant activity of war, but for a moment, everything was quiet. Eventually, they walked on toward rest and the next morning's missions, and the endless work of keeping people alive. Behind them, The A-10s sat on the flight line like patient guardians, waiting for the next crisis that would require impossible precision and pilots willing to fly into danger because someone had to. The next 3 months established Kieran as a legend that would outlive his deployment. His missions became case studies in close air support excellence, referenced in training manuals and discussed in tactical development courses. He flew 247 combat sorties over his deployment, more than double the average for A-10 pilots. He was credited with saving over 300 coalition lives through direct action, a number that didn't count the indirect effects of his presence overhead preventing enemy action. And he did it all while carrying grief that would have grounded most people permanently. But the ultimate validation came not from statistics or awards or leadership recognition. It came from the people he'd protected, the ground forces who understood viscerally what his presence overhead meant. In August, as Kieran's deployment was winding down, a ceremony happened at Bagram that would become the story everyone remembered. The Marine Rifle Company from the Sangin operation, Warhorse Company, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, had returned to Bagram for a memorial service for the 5 Marines killed in that engagement. It was a somber event, the kind of ritual that happened too frequently in combat zones, where warriors gathered to honor fallen brothers before returning to the work that produced more fallen brothers. Lieutenant Colonel Wade had invited Kieran to attend as an honored guest, recognition for his role in preventing the casualty count from being far worse. Kieran had accepted quietly, uncertain what his place was in a memorial for people he'd tried, but failed to save completely. The ceremony happened on Bagram's flight line at sunset, the Hindu Kush Mountains providing a dramatic backdrop. The Marines stood in formation, dress uniforms sharp despite the dust and heat, while Wade delivered the traditional tributes to the fallen. 5 rifles stood in a line, each with a helmet balanced on top and dog tags hanging from the barrel, the battlefield cross, the warrior's memorial. The sun painted everything gold and red, and the mountains watched with ancient indifference. After the formal tributes concluded, Wade called Kieran forward. The pilot walked to the front of the formation feeling intensely out of place, an Air Force officer among Marines, a single father among young warriors, a man whose grief suddenly felt small compared to the collective loss surrounding him. Wade faced the assembled Marines and spoke with the commanding voice of someone who'd led troops through hell. Marines, we're here today to honor brothers who paid the ultimate price. But we're also here to recognize that more of us didn't join them solely because of the pilot standing beside me. Major Kieran Novick flew coverage over us for 4 hours during that engagement. He put rounds danger close to our positions repeatedly, threading geometry that shouldn't be possible, and he kept us alive when we had no right to survive. This is a man who lost his son, came back to theater early, and has spent the last year saving other people's children. I'm told he doesn't accept recognition well, so I won't embarrass him with speeches. But I want every Marine in this company to know that when you needed a guardian angel, you got the best one the Air Force has ever produced. The Marines erupted in the sharp barking, "Oorah!" That was their collective voice, and Kieran felt something break inside his chest. Wade turned to him and extended his hand, pressing something into Kieran's palm. "Major, this was going to be given to my son when he graduates high school next year, but I want you to have it instead. You've earned it more than anyone I know." Kieran looked down at what Wade had given him. It was a challenge coin, the unofficial military tradition of minted metal that units used to honor individuals. This one was special, custom-made, showing the Warhorse Company insignia on one side and a detailed engraving of an A-10 Thunderbolt on the other. Around the edge it read, "Guardian Angel, Sangin District, June 2012. Kieran stared at the coin for a long moment, then looked at Wade with eyes that had learned how to carry grief without collapsing. "Sir, I can't accept this. Your son deserves—" Wade cut him off gently. "My son is alive to graduate high school because you kept me alive to go home. You've already earned this 20 times over. Take it. And when you get home, when you're struggling with what you've been through, look at that coin and remember that you matter. What you do matters. Who you lost matters. All of it matters. Kieran closed his hand around the coin and managed to nod. He couldn't trust his voice, so he didn't try to speak. The Marines understood. They'd all lost things that had no adequate words. The ceremony concluded, and the Marines returned to their duties. But something had shifted in Kieran that evening on Bagram's flight line. He'd spent a year trying to make Dylan's death meaningful through perfect violence and geometric precision. He'd flown missions that should have been impossible, protected people who might otherwise have died, and transformed his grief into protection for strangers. And now, standing among Marines who'd honored him not for his skill but for his character, he finally understood what he'd actually been doing. He'd been proving that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms. It becomes the force that drives people to protect others, to fly into danger, to thread impossible geometry because someone's child is counting on it. Dylan was gone. Rachel was gone. But the love Kieran had felt for them hadn't disappeared. It had become the motivation for keeping other families intact. That night, Kieran sat alone in his quarters for the last time before his deployment ended. He took out Dylan's photograph, the one he could now look at without the world tilting. His son's face smiled back at him with uncomplicated joy, forever frozen at age 8, forever proud of a model airplane they'd built together. Kieran set the Marine's challenge coin beside the photograph. Two pieces of metal, one plastic and one brass, one a child's achievement and one a warrior's recognition. Both of them mattered. Both of them meant something. He thought about the year he'd survived. The missions flown, the lives saved, the grief carried, the transformation from broken father to something stronger than he'd been before loss. It hadn't been healing exactly. Some wounds don't heal, they just become part of who you are. But it had been meaningful. He'd taken the worst thing that could happen to a parent and refused to let it make him smaller. He'd flown through it instead, and in the process, he'd kept 300 people alive who might otherwise have died. The next morning, Kieran Novak flew his final combat mission of the deployment. Captain Torres flew as his wingman, their last flight together before they both rotated back to the United States. The mission was routine: patrol coverage over Kandahar province, on-call support for Army operations, expected contact minimal. They launched into clear morning sky, the A-10s climbing east toward the mountains that had become familiar landmarks over the past year. The tactical frequency stayed quiet. No troops in contact, no emergencies, no crises requiring impossible precision. Just two aircraft orbiting over Afghanistan's endless terrain while the war continued at its own pace below. Torres broke the comfortable silence on their private frequency. "Kieran, this is our last flight together for a while. I wanted to say, it's been an honor. Watching you fly this year, watching you survive what you've survived, it's been the most impressive thing I've ever witnessed. You're going to be okay when you get home, right?" Kieran looked out his canopy at the Hindu Kush mountains stretching to the horizon, snow-capped peaks glowing in morning sun. He thought about what home meant now: an empty house in Colorado Springs, a son's bedroom preserved exactly as he'd left it, a life that would have to be rebuilt from components that didn't fit together anymore. "I don't know," he transmitted back honestly. "But I know I can carry this now. I know I did work here that mattered. And I know that when I look at Dylan's picture, I can tell him I tried to be someone he'd be proud of. That's going to have to be enough." Tor's voice came back warm with understanding. "It's more than enough, Kieran. You're more than enough." They orbited for 4 hours without firing a shot, a quiet ending to a year of sustained combat. When they finally received clearance to return to base, Kieran took one last look at the terrain he'd protected for 12 months. Somewhere down there were Marines, soldiers, and SEALs who'd gone home because of the geometry he'd threaded and the precision he'd maintained through grief that should have been disabling. Somewhere down there were children still alive because he'd waited 18 minutes for them to clear a danger area. Somewhere down there was meaning, even if it came wrapped in tragedy and violence and loss that would never fully resolve. They landed at Bagram for the last time, and Kieran shut down both engines knowing this chapter was ending. He completed his post-flight checks with the same methodical care he'd applied to everything, climbed out of the cockpit, and stood beside the A-10 that had been his constant companion through impossible missions. The aircraft looked exhausted, scorched from repeated gun runs, panels dented from combat damage and hard use, the GAU-8 cannon barrels worn from thousands of rounds fired in anger. But it had never failed him. The crew chief approached with maintenance paperwork and a respectful smile. "Sir, she's been the hardest-working warthog in theater this year. You put her through hell and she kept bringing you home. That's a good bird." Kieran touched the aircraft's titanium skin with something like affection. "Best aircraft I've ever flown. Take care of her for whoever gets her next. She saved a lot of lives." He walked away from the flight line, knowing he was leaving part of himself there. The part that had learned to carry impossible weight while flying through combat with precision measured in meters and seconds. That part would stay in Afghanistan with the missions he'd flown and the people he'd protected. What he took home was different. The understanding that grief doesn't have to destroy you, that love transforms into action, and that meaning can be found even in the worst circumstances if you're willing to do the work of surviving. 3 days later, Kieran boarded a transport aircraft for the journey back to the United States. He carried his deployment bag with the standard collection of equipment and personal items, plus 2 pieces of metal that contained entire stories. Dylan's Cub Scout medal, cracked but intact, and the Marines Challenge coin from Warhorse Company. Both of them rode in his chest pocket, close to his heart, where they would stay for the rest of his life. The transport lifted off from Bagram, climbing into Afghan sky one last time. Kieran looked out the small window at the mountains falling away below, the endless terrain where he'd flown 247 combat sorties, and learned that surviving tragedy meant transforming pain into protection. The aircraft turned west, carrying him home to a life that would have to be completely rebuilt. He didn't know what that would look like yet. He just knew he could carry it now. And that was enough. Kieran returned to the United States in September 2012, exactly 1 year after Dylan's death. The transition from combat operations to peacetime existence hit harder than he'd expected. Bagram had provided structure, daily missions, tactical problems to solve, immediate consequences for decisions made. Home offered only empty rooms and the absence of routines that had made sense when his son was alive. He moved back into the house in Colorado Springs that held Dylan's presence in every corner. The model airplanes they'd built together still sat on shelves in the living room. The bedroom remained exactly as Dylan had left it the morning of the hiking trip that ended his life. Kieran walked through these spaces like a ghost, understanding intellectually that he needed to process grief differently now, but having no practical framework for doing so. The Air Force gave him 60 days of transition leave, time meant for decompression and readjustment. He spent most of it alone, running the same mountain trails where Dylan had died, trying to understand how a 9-year-old could slip on wet rocks and fall in the one way that produced catastrophic injury. The trail was beautiful, aspen groves turning gold in early autumn mountain views that stretched forever. It was also the place where everything had ended, and Kieran needed to make peace with both truths simultaneously. He visited Dylan's grave weekly, a small headstone in a cemetery that held too many young people. He'd sit on the grass beside the marker and talk about the missions he'd flown, the people he'd kept alive, the work he'd tried to do that would make his son proud. These one-sided conversations became the closest thing to therapy he'd engage in. The Air Force offered counseling services. Kieran attended 3 sessions with a clinical psychologist who specialized in combat trauma and grief, then stopped going because talking about feelings in an office felt disconnected from the actual work of surviving. What helped more than therapy was the unexpected community that formed around him. The Marines from Warhorse Company maintained contact, sending emails and messages that updated him on their lives and thanked him for keeping them alive. Captain Torres called weekly from her new duty station, checking in with the same watchful care she'd shown flying as his wingman. Lieutenant Colonel Hargrove wrote a recommendation for Kieran's promotion to lieutenant colonel that read like a military epic, and somehow, through these scattered connections, Kieran stayed anchored to purpose even when home felt purposeless. In November, the Air Force formally recognized his deployment with a Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor device, one of the highest awards for aerial achievement. The ceremony happened at Peterson Air Force Base with full military honors. Kieran stood at attention, while a general he'd never met read the citation documenting his 247 combat sorties and his role in protecting coalition forces through sustained operations. The language was bureaucratic and formal, reducing the year's experiences to phrases like exceptional tactical proficiency and unwavering dedication to mission accomplishment. It missed everything that mattered, but documented that the work had been witnessed and valued. After the ceremony, as Kieran was leaving the building, a young airman stopped him in the hallway. The kid couldn't have been more than 20 years old, fresh-faced and nervous, wearing the insignia of an A-10 crew chief in training. "Sir, I heard about what you did in Afghanistan, about flying all those missions after losing your son. I just wanted to say, my dad died last year, and I've been struggling with whether I can still do this job. But hearing about you, knowing someone can carry that much and still fly, it helps, so thank you." Kieran looked at this young airman who just shared something intensely personal with a stranger and felt his throat tighten. "What's your name, airman?" "Miller, sir. Airman First Class Jason Miller." Kieran extended his hand. "Jason, losing a parent is different than losing a child, but grief is grief. It doesn't disqualify you from doing hard things. It just means you understand why hard things matter. Keep doing the work. Your dad would want that." They shook hands, and the airman walked away looking slightly less lost. Kieran stood in the hallway for a moment longer, understanding that his story was having effects beyond his own survival. Other people were watching how he carried this, learning from his example, finding permission to continue despite their own losses. It was both humbling and terrifying. December brought the first Christmas without Dylan. Kieran had been dreading this milestone since September, knowing that holidays were when absence became sharpest. He'd considered traveling somewhere to avoid the memories, but ultimately stayed in Colorado Springs because running from grief hadn't worked yet and probably wouldn't start working now. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear, mountain sky perfect blue. Kieran drove to the cemetery carrying the model airplane he and Dylan had built together, a small balsa wood Cessna painted with careful attention to detail. He'd kept it on the mantel since his son's death, unable to put it away but unable to look at it without pain. Now, sitting beside Dylan's grave in crystalline winter air, he held the model airplane and tried to explain something he'd been working toward for months. "Dylan, I've been trying to figure out what to do with everything that happened this year. I went to Afghanistan because I didn't know how to be your dad anymore if you weren't here. And I flew all those missions because keeping other people's kids alive felt like the only thing that made sense. I don't know if that was healthy, but it's what I could manage. Now I'm home, and I have to figure out how to live here without you. I don't have an answer yet, but I'm working on it. I wanted you to know that everything I did over there, every mission I flew, every Marine I kept alive, all of it was because you taught me what mattered. You were 9 years old and you already understood that helping people through storms was important work. I just took that lesson into a bigger storm. I hope that makes you proud. I hope wherever you are, you know your dad didn't give up. I'm still here. I'm still trying. And I'll keep trying as long as I have breath." He set the model airplane against the headstone, a small offering that wouldn't decay in the weather, and walked back to his truck. The grief was still crushing, still present in every moment, but it had shifted from something that disabled him to something he could carry while functioning. That was progress. That was survival. That was enough for today. The following months established a new pattern. Kieran returned to flight status in January 2013, assigned to the 23rd Fighter Group at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia. The reassignment meant leaving Colorado and the house where Dylan had grown up, a transition that was both necessary and devastating. He sold the house to a young family with children, hoping that new life in those rooms would honor the life that had ended. He kept only what he could carry: photographs, some of Dylan's artwork from school, the model airplanes they'd built together, and the cracked Cub Scout medal that had flown combat missions in Afghanistan. Everything else got donated or discarded, the material residue of a life that no longer existed. Moody Air Force Base was different than Bagram in every way that mattered. The missions were training flights instead of combat sorties. The urgency was manufactured rather than immediate. The consequences for mistakes were professional rather than mortal. Kieran flew A-10s in practice scenarios, training younger pilots in close air support tactics, and tried to find meaning in work that felt abstract compared to keeping Marines alive in Afghanistan. It was difficult. The training environment lacked the clarity of purpose that combat had provided. There was no clear cause and effect, no immediate feedback that his work mattered. He'd gotten addicted to the importance of combat operations, and peacetime flying felt like simulation after having experienced the real thing. The other pilots at Moody noticed his struggle. They'd heard about his deployment, about his son, about the legend of Rattler-6 who'd flown with impossible precision through a year of grief. They treated him with cautious respect, unsure how to engage with someone whose experiences existed beyond their reference frame. Captain Torres had warned him about this during one of their phone calls. Kieran, you're going to have a hard time relating to pilots who haven't been through what you've been through. They're going to feel inadequate around you, and you're going to feel isolated because they don't understand. You need to find a way to bridge that gap, or you'll end up alone even in a squadron full of people. She was right. Kieran spent the first 3 months at Moody existing in professional isolation, respected but not connected. He flew his training missions with competence that bordered on excessive, demonstrated close air support tactics that made younger pilots take notes, and then disappeared to his off-base apartment where he lived like someone still deployed. The pattern was unsustainable, and he knew it. The breaking point came in April during a training mission that should have been routine. Kieran was leading a 4-ship formation through a practice close air support scenario, working with ground controllers who were simulating troops in contact. The exercise involved coordinating multiple aircraft against multiple targets while managing simulated collateral damage concerns and danger close restrictions. It was the kind of training that prepared pilots for real-world missions, and Kieran executed it with mechanical excellence. But halfway through the exercise, the ground controller threw in a simulated civilian casualty scenario, a pop-up target representing non-combatants in the engagement area that required immediate mission abort. It was standard training protocol, designed to test pilot decision-making under pressure. For Kieran, it triggered something beyond tactical assessment. He remembered the children in the Arghandab River Valley, the 8 kids herding goats near a compound about to be destroyed. He remembered waiting 18 minutes for them to clear the area, watching them through his targeting pod while ground controllers expressed impatience. He remembered Dylan's face at age 8, unaware of adult dangers, existing completely in the moment. The memory hit with physical force. Kieran aborted the simulated attack, transmitted proper radio calls, and continued leading the formation through the rest of the exercise. But something inside had cracked. After landing, he sat in his aircraft for 10 minutes after completing post-flight checks, trying to steady his breathing. The crew chief eventually climbed the ladder to check if he was okay. Kieran waved him off and forced himself to climb out of the cockpit. He walked to the debrief trying to rebuild the mechanical composure that had carried him through Afghanistan. But in the debrief room, surrounded by younger pilots discussing the training mission's tactical lessons, he suddenly understood what was happening. He'd been using work as a substitute for grief processing since Dylan's death. Combat operations had provided enough intensity and immediate purpose that he could avoid the actual emotional labor of surviving loss. Now, without that intensity, everything he'd been avoiding for 18 months was catching up. He needed help, and he needed to ask for it, which felt harder than anything he'd done in Afghanistan. After the debrief, Kieran made 2 decisions that changed his trajectory. First, he called the base mental health clinic and scheduled an appointment with a counselor who specialized in grief and combat trauma. Second, he reached out to the younger pilots in his squadron and offered to start a weekly close air support tactics discussion group. Both decisions were attempts to stop isolating, to start processing instead of avoiding, and to find purpose in peacetime that didn't require combat's intensity. The counseling session started weekly and immediately felt different than his previous attempts at therapy. The counselor, a civilian contractor named Dr. Sarah Chen, had worked with military personnel for 20 years and immediately recognized what Kieran was struggling with. She didn't try to fix him or make the grief disappear. She just helped him understand that avoiding emotional pain while demonstrating tactical excellence was its own form of dysfunction. Their sessions became archaeological work, carefully excavating the layers of loss and survival that Kieran had compressed into functional armor. The tactics discussion group took off in ways he hadn't expected. The younger pilots were hungry for knowledge from someone who'd flown real combat missions, and Kieran discovered that teaching gave him purpose beyond flying. He'd walk them through scenarios from Afghanistan, explaining his decision-making in situations where the textbook answers didn't work. He discussed the geometry of danger-close gun runs, the psychology of communicating with ground forces under fire, the emotional discipline required to maintain precision when Marines were dying. The younger pilots listened with complete attention, taking notes and asking questions that made Kieran think deeply about experiences he'd been avoiding thinking about. Through teaching, he started processing. Through processing, he started healing in ways that solitary grief couldn't accomplish. By summer 2013, Kieran had established something resembling stability. He flew training missions with competence instead of mechanical detachment. He maintained regular counseling sessions where he worked through grief at a pace that was sustainable. He led the tactics discussion group with energy that suggested genuine engagement rather than obligation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he started building relationships with the other pilots in his squadron. They learned he could smile occasionally, that he had a dry sense of humor, that he was generous with mentorship for anyone willing to ask questions. He remained private about his personal life, but the isolation transformed from impenetrable to simply reserved. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where everything resolved. But by Dylan's second death anniversary in September 2013, Kieran could visit his son's grave without feeling the world collapse. He could look at photographs without triggering complete emotional shutdown. He could talk about Dylan in therapy sessions without mechanical detachment or overwhelming pain. The grief was still present, still heavy, but it had integrated into his identity rather than dominating it. Dr. Chen explained it during one of their sessions. Kieran, you're learning to carry loss as part of who you are rather than something you're fighting against. That's what integration looks like. The pain doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling your entire existence. You can be a grieving father and a capable pilot and a good mentor simultaneously. Those identities can coexist. It made sense intellectually. Living it was harder. But Kieran kept showing up to the work of surviving, kept flying missions that mattered even in training, kept teaching younger pilots, kept attending therapy sessions, kept visiting Dylan's grave, and kept believing that meaning could be found even in peacetime. 2 years after losing his son, Kieran Novick had learned to be more than his grief. He'd learned to be someone Dylan would recognize: a father, a pilot, a teacher, a survivor. The work continued, the missions kept coming, and life persisted despite everything. That was enough. That was survival. That was the long geometry of grief threaded into something approximating wholeness. The years that followed established Kieran as something beyond a skilled pilot. He became the instructor that younger aviators sought out, the mentor whose combat experience translated into teaching that prepared people for reality. His tactics discussion group at Moody evolved into a formal close air support weapons school, recognized by Air Combat Command as a premier training program. Pilots from across the Air Force requested assignments to Moody specifically to train under Kieran Novick, and his influence spread through a generation of A-10 pilots who would carry his lessons into future conflicts. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 2014, then full colonel in 2018, and eventually took command of the 23rd Fighter Group in 2019. His leadership style reflected everything he'd learned through tragedy. He demanded excellence, but understood that people came to the work carrying invisible burdens. He maintained high standards while creating space for human vulnerability, and he built a squadron culture where competence and compassion coexisted. The pilots under his command knew he'd survived impossible circumstances and learned to fly through grief without sacrificing precision. That combination inspired loyalty that went beyond professional respect. But the ultimate recognition came not from military leadership, but from the community of ground forces who'd been under his protection. In 2016, the Marine Corps invited Kieran to speak at a symposium on close air support integration. The audience consisted of infantry officers, forward air controllers, and aviation planners trying to improve the coordination between air and ground forces. Kieran's presentation was supposed to focus on tactical lessons from Afghanistan, but midway through his prepared remarks, he deviated into territory he hadn't planned to explore. He started talking about Dylan. He told the assembled Marines and soldiers about losing his son, about flying combat missions while carrying grief that should have been disabling, about learning that protection could be its own form of meaning. He talked about the children in the Arghandab River Valley, about waiting 18 minutes because their lives mattered more than operational efficiency, about how every danger-close gun run was motivated by the understanding that someone's child was counting on impossible precision. The room went completely silent. These were combat veterans who'd seen terrible things, who understood loss in ways that civilians couldn't, and they recognized something authentic in Kieran's testimony. When he finished speaking, the applause lasted longer than protocol required. Afterward, dozens of Marines and soldiers approached him with stories. They'd been in units he'd protected in Afghanistan. They'd called for close air support and received it from Rattler 6. They'd gone home to their families because of gun runs he'd flown, strikes he'd coordinated, missions he'd executed while carrying his own catastrophic loss. One Marine gunnery sergeant, a forward air controller who'd worked with Kieran during the Sangin operation, presented him with a combat deployment photograph. It showed Kieran's A-10 overhead during that engagement, captured from the ground during the battle. The image was grainy and dramatic, the warthog silhouetted against smoke and mountain backdrop, frozen in the moment of keeping Marines alive. On the back of the photograph, the entire rifle platoon had signed their names with a simple message. To Rattler 6, Guardian Angel, Sangin District, you brought us home. We'll never forget. Kieran accepted the photograph with hands that trembled slightly despite years of stability. That image would hang in his office for the rest of his career, a reminder that the work had mattered, that flying through grief had produced meaning, that Dylan's death hadn't been the end of purpose. The recognition continued through subsequent years. In 2018, the Air Force Association invited Kieran to receive the Jabara Award for airmanship, recognizing him as the service's most outstanding fighter pilot. The ceremony happened in Washington, D.C. with full military pageantry. Kieran stood on stage while a general read his biography. The missions flown, the Marines saved, the transformation from bereaved father to legendary close air support pilot. The audience included senior military leadership, members of Congress, and defense industry executives who shaped air power policy. But the people Kieran cared about most were sitting in the front row. Captain Melissa Torres, now a lieutenant colonel herself, Lieutenant Colonel Vance Hargrove, retired and gray-haired, the Marine gunnery sergeant from the symposium, and a dozen other service members who'd been under his protection in Afghanistan. They traveled to witness his recognition, these people whose lives had intersected with his during the worst and best moments of his career. In his acceptance speech, Kieran spoke for exactly 5 minutes. He thanked the Air Force for the recognition, acknowledged the people who'd supported him through impossible circumstances, and then told the truth that mattered most. This award has my name on it, but it belongs to my son Dylan, who taught me that helping people through storms was important work. He was 9 years old and already understood what took me 40 years and a combat deployment to figure out. Everything I accomplished in Afghanistan, every Marine I kept alive, every mission I flew, all of it was because Dylan showed me that competence combined with compassion was the only thing worth pursuing. He's gone now, but his influence remains. And if this award means anything, it means that love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms into the force that drives us to protect others, to fly into danger, to thread impossible geometry because someone's child is counting on it. Thank you. The applause was subdued but genuine. These were military professionals who understood that the real story wasn't about tactics or technical skill. It was about a father who'd survived the worst thing that could happen and transformed his grief into protection for strangers' children. That was the legacy. That was what mattered. After the ceremony, Kieran spent hours talking with the people who traveled to see him honored. They shared stories he'd never heard. Marines discussing how his presence overhead had given them confidence to push into contested areas. Soldiers explaining how his willingness to fly danger-close missions had changed their tactical calculus. Pilots describing how his example had influenced their own approach to close air support. Each story added layers to understanding that his work had rippled through systems beyond his awareness. Lieutenant Colonel Torres pulled him aside as the evening wound down. They found a quiet corner away from the crowd, two pilots who'd flown through impossible circumstances together and remained connected through years of separate assignments. Kieran, I've been your wingman, your friend, and your witness through all of this. I need you to understand something. What you did, surviving Dylan's death while flying combat missions, transforming grief into protection, building a career that honors his memory, that's the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen. You're a legend and you've earned it. But more than that, you're proof that tragedy doesn't have to destroy people. You're proof that love persists beyond loss. That matters to more people than you know. Kieran looked at Torres, this pilot who'd watched him through his worst moments and never wavered in support, and felt gratitude that had no adequate expression. Melissa, I couldn't have survived any of this without you flying wing. You kept me honest, kept me safe, and kept me connected to humanity when I was trying to become a machine. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you. They stood together in the margins of a military ceremony, two veterans who understood that the real work of service happened in the spaces between official recognition. Eventually, they rejoined the larger group, but the moment of acknowledgement remained. A quiet recognition that survival required community, that grief needed witnesses, and that the hardest work happened in conversations that would never generate awards or citations. Kieran Novick returned home to Georgia carrying the Jabara Award and understanding that his story had become larger than himself. Young pilots would learn his tactics. Ground forces would remember his protection. Dylan's influence would persist through the people Kieran had kept alive, spreading through generations in ways that couldn't be mapped or quantified. That was legacy. That was immortality of a sort. That was what it meant to transform tragedy into something that helped others survive their own impossible circumstances. The work continued. The missions kept coming. And life persisted, meaningful and heavy and beautiful, threaded through with grief that had become part of the geometry rather than an obstacle to flying. Kieran had learned to carry it all, the loss, the love, the responsibility, the recognition. And in carrying it well, he'd honored his son more than any medal or ceremony ever could. That was enough. That was everything. That was the long journey from September 2011 to a place where survival felt like victory instead of merely endurance. Even the SEALs looked up when his story was told, and the sky that had witnessed his grief now held his legacy. Dylan's medal, cracked but intact, remained in a shadow box on Kieran's office wall beside the photograph from Sangin District. And somewhere in that combination of plastic and memory and purpose, a 9-year-old boy's influence continued shaping how warriors understood the relationship between loss and protection, between grief and excellence, between dying and meaning. The story would persist, told in ready rooms and tactical discussions, and quiet moments when someone needed to understand that surviving impossible circumstances was itself a form of extraordinary achievement.